Hello, everybody. I'm so excited to welcome today almost Dr. Leah-Perl Shollar. Um, Mrs. Shollar is the Dean of Curriculum and Instruction at Yeshiva Schools of Pittsburgh, and she is just finishing her doctorate. She sent me her dissertation, or the draft, I guess, the current draft of the dissertation, which is going to be finished soon, the next few months. And it was absolutely riveting. It's all about the history, really the story of the development of girls' education from over the last couple of centuries and how that influences girls' education today. There were so many details and stories and anecdotes that were like so new to me and gave me so much insight. It was really, really eye-opening to read. And I can't believe haven't found you until now. I actually did a series. We did a series a couple years ago about women's Torah learning, and we explored both halachic and hashkafic sources, and also two of the scholars that you reference a lot in your dissertation. Dr. Talia Lowenthal and Dr. Leslie Ginsberg Klein. I interviewed both of them about the history of like girls' education in the Hasidic world, and Sara Schenirer, respectively. And you would have been like the natural next person to interview after that. So we're doing this a little bit late, but we're going to fit it in here. And there's so much that I would love to discuss with you about this topic. So welcome, and thank you so much for coming on. Maybe just start before we get into like the actual research that you've done, which is so extensive. It's really like, it's just a masterpiece how much research has gone into developing the story that you tell. Maybe tell us a little bit about yourself, like what led you down this path of exploring the story of Orthodox girls at Torah education, and can you share about some of your own educational experiences growing up and how that may have fueled your curiosity for this topic?
Sure. Thank you, Hadassah, for having me. This is a real honor, and I'm excited to share my passion about this topic, which is something that's very meaningful to me personally. And I would say that the actual topic of the dissertation is really an outgrowth of my own personal life journey in education and Torah education in particular. My parents were among the first wave of Baalei Tshuva back in the 70s, many decades ago. And I think from that, I gained an appreciation for the preciousness of Torah and also how every person really has to make their own connection with it. So that's kind of where I would say I start from. I was very fortunate to have tremendously special and unique school experiences as a child. I met a lot of really prominent Torah educators of the last few decades. My early years were spent in a Hebrew academy, which was founded by a Holocaust survivor from Hungary. And he was a very, Orthodox person, a very, you could say today, Haredi person. But the school was a community school. And the next educational experience I had was in a day school in Sunnyvale, which was founded by people. It was a Torah Masorah school, but probably more I would say to the left. It was a very Zioni school. There were a lot of Israelis there. My classes were often in Hebrew, and I was fortunate in that sense that I gained a really strong foundation in understanding Hebrew and being able to speak and read it fluently, which was very helpful to me in later years. The high school that I went to initially was kind of a girls' offshoot of Ner Yisrael, which is, I guess you could say, moderate yeshivish if you want to get labels. And it was a very inspiring school. I really was fortunate to have teachers who were excited about what they were teaching and really loved chinuch and Torah learning and loved the girls. The rest of my high school was in the Bais Yaakov in Denver, which was in a German Jewish community. And that was very interesting for me because I suddenly was seeing many different flavors of Orthodoxy, and the attitudes there were both much more stringent than in the prior school, but also both academically and religiously. And at the same time, there was this clear message that we were expected to know about what was going on in the world and to be well-rounded, educated people. And that was a very clear through line from Rav Hirsch. The community itself was comprised of people who had fled Germany, both before, during, and after the war. And many of the families, they still spoke German to each other at home. It was a very unique environment. My seminary experience was in a girls' offshoot of TELS, which was very sharp, we would say. And actually, a lot of the skills that I have in independent learning came from that school. It was a real pressure cooker environment. It was like they took all of the A plus girls and put them in one school and then made the learning, kind of turned it up a few notches so that suddenly some of us were getting B's or even C's, which was, I think, in retrospect, a very good experience because we were forced to expand our self-identity beyond just I'm smart. And that's good because, that can't be your whole
Yeah,
identity.
totally. I agree
Yeah.
with that.
And it was also my first time learning Gemara, which was interesting. We had Mrs. Torsky, Basha Torsky, and she essentially made us go copy out Gemaras for Parsha class every week. Usually you think of Parsha class as like an easy class. Her Parsha class was one of the hardest subjects we had. Suddenly we were looking up Sfarim I didn't even know existed. They were in Aramaic, and her request was you have to copy it down and then come back to class and we'll learn it. So that was kind of my experience. I took a year off to teach first grade in Sunnyvale, California, where I had been a student. And then after that, I went to Bais Rivka, mostly because I had gone to visit a friend who was there, and I found it very inspiring. And I felt, I didn't yet know the phrase Machda Eretz Yisrael, but I felt when I was in Crown Heights, this is the same feeling I had when I was in Israel. This is what I want. So I moved to Crown Heights, and that was kind of how I came full circle back to Lubavitch. I would say also that I was very fortunate to learn from Rebbetzin Yehudas Heller, Mara Heller, in seminary. And one of the things that I saw from her was that there was a whole world I didn't know about, of Torah learning that I didn't know about. And I had, in school, I had a lot of questions, but they were often not encouraged. They were often discouraged. And even something simple like, what happened at Matan Torah that before they were Jewish, they weren't Jewish, but then suddenly they're Jewish. No one could explain to me what was the transition. Like they were a family and suddenly they're a nation. And she had answers to a lot of these questions, and they were very grounded in text. And she's the one who introduced me to a lot of the Hasidic thinkers that I later came to love. So I can say that I was really fortunate to receive a very broad education, but it also, this kind of moving around vagabond existence on some level allowed me to be an insider in many different communities, and also to look at it from an outside perspective and say, like, what's different about this, or why do they do it this way and not that way? And I think at some point I had this fantasy when I was in school as a teenager, like a blending together Hasidus and the Hirschian approach. I was trying to understand, like, how do these work? Could they work together, So that was something that was very fascinating to me, and perhaps because science is one of the things I love, so I didn't want to feel for myself like science is tray for us, or how do I come to make this a Torah thing. So that was also kind of like in the background. I always was very curious, reading and wanting to know more about the world and just like how do things work and understanding, the cell and that kind of. My initial plan was to become a neuroscientist, and for various reasons I didn't go down that route, but it's still something that I find fascinating and inspiring, and I think just in general, knowledge is a gift that Hashem gives us, and I wanted to be able to embrace it in a way that felt both authentic but also holy.
Wow, amazing. And I think like what you described as like, how do I like reconcile this sort of like Hasidic Chabad approach and the Hirschian approach? That's literally exactly what you explore in this dissertation. So let's get right into it. Okay, so it's hard to condense a 400-page dissertation into a hour-long interview, but let's try to like explore some of the highlights, and specifically like what can we sort of learn from those sort of the history that you describe, and what kind of implications might it have in our lives. So maybe start just by describing the state of Jewish women and girls in the 19th to 20th century. What was their relationship with their Jewish identity? What was their sense? How would you describe their sense of belonging within the Jewish community? And if you can, maybe like, can you draw some parallels to the way women and girls might feel today? I remember I've heard a lot about this, like in from many places before reading your dissertation, but you described it in such great detail. It was very eye-opening to me to like hear the extremity of what was going on. So maybe
Yeah.
describe it a little bit.
Sure. So it really varied from country to country. And I
Mm.
think as each country was confronted with enlightenment and all of that that entails the modernity, those challenges, they had to try to figure out how are they going to respond. And so that's why Rav Hirsch is so crucial to the story of Jewish girls' education, because he was sort of like ground zero for this battle. And in his circumstances, Germany was already extremely assimilated. And so when he came in, he was trying to find a way to make Judaism appealing to Jews in general, but girls in particular. And he felt like you cannot have Jewish continuity without Jewish girls, and that they need to be educated the same way as the boys were. So his approach was to set up essentially what we would now call a day school, and the education between the girls and the boys was quite similar, with some exceptions. They did not learn Gemara, but they did learn Chumash and they did learn other subjects. Compared to today's day school, you would be surprised because it was a small number of classes and it was not for a long time. But as Judith Grunfeld Rosenbaum, who was later part of the Bais Yaakov movement, explained, a lot of their secular, quote, secular subjects were also taught by religious people. And so therefore everything was sort of infused with this religious flavor. And there wasn't this stark divide between Judaic and general studies, which is an interesting thing to think about because, as the philosopher Durkheim says, this sort of like constellation of profane and secular, and there's a bright line between them, is one of like the distinguishing features of a religious traditional society. So he sought to sort of bring everything under the rubric of holiness. And he talked about how the general studies, if you want to call them that, are like the handmaidens to the princess. The princess is the Torah. There's no there's no equality between them, but they're there to serve her. So for girls in Germany, who initially were quite secularized and leaving Yiddishkeit, the people who were part of his community, the Austritt-Gemeinde, they actually were educated and pious. Like it says, they went to shul, they davened, they were very connected and affiliated, and yet they also were very acculturated. They were very German in many ways, and their approach, their language, their way of thinking. Judith Grunbaum talks about how everybody was a fan of Goethe and read his works and respected him and looked up to him, and her father, who was Hungarian, was dismissive, very dismissive of him, and she was shocked by his, how could you be? So from the perspective of German Jews, they already were starting to work on some kind of connection. And Hirsch himself says, if you want your girls to choose, Amos over Shakespeare or Yeshayahu over Goethe, you have to educate them. You can't just tell them, do this. Which is actually an interesting connection to a letter that the Rebbe Rayat sends to Rabbi Chayfetz, where he talks about the shortcomings of Kabbalas Ol. Like, Kabbalas Ol is part of being a Torah Jew, but you can't just rely on Kabbalas Ol because it does not result in lasting attachment. People don't remain with things that they've been forced to do just because. There has to be some point at which they consciously step in and embrace this. So that was the situation in Germany. And the situation in Eastern Europe was quite different. So the Russian community, for example, the Russian Maskilim were already making schools. We know that from the stories of the Tzemach Tzedek and the fight with Uvarov, who was the Minister of Education, and then later Lilienthal. They were seeking, the Russian communists were seeking, or not necessarily communists, the Russian Maskilim were seeking to inculcate their values in the next generation. And they used the famous phrase, the hand that rocks the cradle rules the world. So they wanted to remake Jewish girls into this sort of Russian intelligentsia approach. But the Orthodox community, because they saw girls' education as being affiliated and an outcome of modernity, were very, very wary. And in fact, they actively rejected it. So as Rachel Manikin describes in her book about the runaway girls of Galicia, which is a shocking story, girls were leaving to join convents, marry non-Jewish Polish men, just live a secular life. And there was clearly a crisis in the community, and people were very much aware of that. In fact, the famous story of Chaya Kluger, who was profiled in her book in some depth, her great-great-grandfather was actually the Friedrich uncle, his mother's brother. So clearly he was aware of this as well. This is a widespread, it's not just like some families. It was many families who were very innately connected to Hasidus, Yiddishkeit, like not people who are on the periphery, people whose families were central to Orthodox life. And there was
Can
tremendous,
you actually just give a summary of the story of Chaya Kluger for people who don't know, and
sure,
the impact that it had on sort of people's awareness of how deeply problematic this
yes.
situation was?
So I would recommend anyone who wants the full story to read Professor Manikin's book. It's quite fascinating and shocking. Chaya Kluger is one of the stories, one of the people she profiles. She's a young girl. Her mother is a descendant of the Divrei Sons, and her family is Hasidic. Her father was extremely wealthy, I think, a textile factory, and they lived in one of the modern neighborhoods in Łódź. And she was very typically educated for a girl of her time and community, in that she received a full education from the Polish government, which was kind of what they call gymnasia, which today we would call like a prep school. So she was educated in Latin and Greek and math and everything, and she wanted to go on and learn more. And her parents got her extra classes in piano and French and all of this. And when they decided that she should get married at the age of 15 or 16, she was completely opposed to it, and they told her essentially you have no choice. What happened with the education of the time, because so many Hasidic families were giving their daughters this very intense and rich general studies education, but no Judaic education at all, other than just like what they absorbed in the home, is that they started to have different worldviews, different life goals, different ideas about what they wanted. And they did not want to marry a yeshiva boy who didn't know how to speak Polish, fluently, elegantly, and so forth. They didn't want to marry a Polish boy who had never been to the theater. They wanted to go see plays and read literature and famous Polish poetry and all of that. And they didn't have any counterbalance.
Can I ask a question? How did they get to that point? I mean, like, what would motivate a Hasidic family to send their daughters or give their daughters this very, very rich secular education? Was it because there was like a government mandate,
Right.
or was it sort of like they just felt like there was no reason why not? Like, how did they get to that point where these girls were like so entrenched in secular academics and culture? Like
Right.
that's.
So the Polish government had passed a compulsory education law, and there was a conversation, what will we do about our sons? We can't take them out of yeshiva. So the idea was, if we all send our daughters, the seats in the schools will fill up and there'll be no room for the boys, and then we'll be able to legitimately say, well, we had to send them to yeshiva because there was no space. So we literally have two completely different educations going on, one for girls and one for boys. It's not even that it's gendered, it's just like two different worlds. One is preparing girls to be part of the Polish world and society, and the other was preparing boys to be part of a Jewish, yeshivish, or Hasidic world. And someone like Gutta Sternbuch talks to her family about how her brother was so frum that he would not address her at the dinner table. He would ask his mother, "Mother, can you please ask Gutta to pass me the salt?" Okay, but meanwhile, she herself is like, this is ridiculous and stupid. That was already generations later, and she was educated. But just to give you an idea of how far apart they were, Friday nights, families would sit down at the Shabbos table. The father, the brother, they would be singing Nuganim, and the girls would get up and go out. It would be like today, going out to the movies, go out to the theater with their sleeveless dresses and, makeup and all of that. They were just living in different planets, essentially, different worlds. So Chaya Kluger wanted to go on to higher education. Her parents wanted her to get married. She sort of agreed to marry if her parents would pay for her to go on for a little more schooling, and they did. And she married, but she basically told her husband, like, we're not married, by the way. We're just happen to be living in this apartment together, but we're not married. And then eventually she and her sister, who was younger than her, I didn't really talk about her sister much, Leah, she was also going to be engaged to be married, and the two sisters decided they're going to run away from home, and they sued their parents for parental support because her parents were wealthy. They wanted them to support the girls while they went to college and earned degrees. And this case actually went all the way up to the Austrian Supreme Court, and they won, and they were given they were awarded this financial amount of money and awarded like a court custodian who was going to watch over their needs. And essentially from that young age, they were away from home and on their own, living the life they wanted to live. Chaya Kluger later ended up marrying a secularized Jew, and they lived in Krakow and were part of the Reform community there. But essentially the community saw how someone like her parents, who were so prominent and prestigious and had the financial means to hire lawyers and so forth, they essentially were forced into this and they couldn't stop themselves from having to carry out a kind of educational plan they didn't agree with. And I think that was when they started to talk about what are we going to do? Should we make schools for the girls? Should we do that? And other people were saying things like, this is just the kind of, you're just following with the reform movement. This is how the maskilim talk. This is crazy. All you need to do is tell your girls don't. And if they're good girls, they won't. And then other people are saying, well, maybe if we give them some books by Marcus Lehman, which is interesting because he was taking the German approach. And they were saying, we reject that approach. So it was a terrible situation, honestly. And so many girls were lost. It's hard to know really how many. But that was the situation essentially until World War II and when Sara Schenirer arose.
So do we have data on, because I know the Haskalah movement obviously influenced men as well, or boys as well. Do we have data on like the difference between the genders of like how they were impacted?
That would be really interesting. I haven't done a study about that, but I did read a lot about the yeshiva movement and the maskilim. And there it seems like the boys were more, not so much leaving Yiddishkeit, but they're more going into like Haskalic forms of Yiddishkeit, maskilic forms of like Hebraicists, Zionists, writing journals, becoming secularized but Jewish, whereas in the eastern parts where the girls didn't have this option, they often were just leaving Yiddishkeit behind. So like Chaya Kluger wasn't looking to become part of the Jewish maskilic movement. She just was like, I want to be more Polish. Whereas in the boys, it seems, if you look at like Ben Yehuda or many of those stories of like the boys in the yeshiva where they have, Robinson Crusoe under the Gemara, there's a lot more external compliance, but less, not necessarily internal compliance. Whereas with the girls, it was much more in your face. They were wearing mini skirts. They were wearing sleeveless dresses. They were, just like checking out. It was harder to avoid.
Wow, wow, interesting. So,
Yeah.
first of all, I think it's fascinating that it took so long. I mean, I was specifically in Poland for
Right.
there to be a response to this. Um, yeah, I'm wondering if you could talk that a little bit, like what took so long, but also, and maybe after that you can start getting into some, just like an overview of like there were, because I think Sara Schenirer and the Bais Yaakov movement is very famous, but
Yes.
there were many other schools that were started before Bais Yaakov, and could we talk about the different schools? What was the agenda of each? Because they all kind of had a little bit of a different like philosophy,
Right.
and a little bit of a different mission. And could we sort of compare those to each other? What is it about Bais Yaakov that made Bais Yaakov so famous or so revolutionary as opposed to the schools that came before it? Yeah, give us a little bit of an overview of that.
Okay, so the schools. So why did it take so long? I think just in general, traditional communities, by virtue of the fact that they are always basing what they do now on what was done before, are very averse to change. And sometimes to our own detriment, we're not willing to do the next thing because we're afraid of breaking with, Derech Yisrael Saba. That's not how our grandfathers did it in Europe, and we want to feel like we're carrying on the authentic tradition, which is legitimate. And I think a real concern. A traditional community can't just, flip right and left with every new initiative or whatever the whim of the day is. There has to be some measured thinking. The question is, when have you gotten to the point where measured thinking is no longer enough and you need to move to action? And one of the scholars that I read said, why did Sara Schenirer succeed when others had failed? Is because she started with action first and only questions later. It is true that she did get a bracha from the Belzer Rebbe, but it was a very generic bracha, which I'll talk about shortly. In terms of the different schooling options, so it was also very much kind of like country by country. So in Poland, they had the Chavetzelet school, which was started by some German Jewish rabbis who had come to Poland during World War I. And they were initially, before Germany lost, they had conquered a lot of Polish territory, and they were put in charge of the Jewish community in what at the time was Greater Russia, and also asked to set up schooling systems. So they came in, and essentially there was a cheder movement for the boys, and there was really nothing for the girls. And so they started putting together schools, particularly from the Karlbach family to Karlbach brothers, one in Latvia and one in Poland, and also Rabbi Cohn, who was one of the rabbis, another German rabbi, and they essentially set up Rav Hirschian schools for kids, which were like day schools, and they did get them started. So Chavetzelet was a fairly well known, and actually was interesting to find out that the sociologist Deborah Tannen's grandmother was the general studies principal at Chavetzelet, which was kind of a funny little quirk of history. The Chavetzelet school continued to operate up to and including during World War II. In the ghetto, it did continue to exist. But it never really took off and became a network the way that Bais Yaakov did, because Agudas Yisrael essentially adopted Bais Yaakov as their flagship school through their Keren HaTorah. It was the Agudas Yisrael school for girls. They also had Agudas Yisrael schools for boys, but Bais Yaakov essentially started because of Sara Schenirer, but was able to continue growing because of Agudas Yisrael. And they raised the money for it. They also brought in a lot of German Jewish professionals who were educators, like the Rabbi Deutschlander and others, including Judith Grunbaum, who were able to provide teacher training, develop curriculum, make libraries, publish books. They all came in with that infrastructure. So Sara Schenirer had the passion. She had the initial vision for what she wanted to carry out. And she also, without her, there would be no Bais Yaakov. There's no way that it could have just been an initiative of Agudas Yisrael. But they were able to provide the support she needed to enact her vision, is what I would say. The other school that existed in Lithuania was the Yavna school. And actually, someone has done some interesting research. Mrs. Dr. Rosenbaumas, whose parents are from Lithuania, and her mother was a graduate of the school, actually has tried to put together a website, which hopefully some researcher will pick up the baton, called Bat Kamaat. And it is really a record of the Yavna School for Girls, which is really quite unique in Jewish history, even amongst the girls' schools, and probably like maybe a little bit where my heart lies on some level. Like, I found it a fascinating school. They had very, very rigorous education and very inspiring teachers, but also extremely frum. So they talk about how at some point they had a teacher who was teaching them Yeshayahu, and the girls all came home like fired up about Yeshayahu. But then as they started talking, the parents felt like, this sounds a little too Tzioni. Like, we don't think that this is kosher. And they fired him. And they, this is kind of the initiating incident that started the Yavna school as it was in interwar Europe. And Rabbi Bloch, who was part of the Telz movement, was very deeply involved with that as well. There is someone who's been researching one of the young women from the Telz community who was part of Yavna. Hadassah Levin, actually, is her name. Hirschenhorn, her married name. And she's definitely worth looking into, and an interesting figure. And you come away with a feeling of how learned and pious these women were. Truly pious, like really sincerely so. That is actually a number of people from that school went on to be involved with different schools in the United States, in Cleveland and in Muncie, and they're worthy of deeper investigation in themselves. So I hope that answers some of those questions.
Yeah, can you give like maybe a contrast between Bais Yaakov and Yavna in terms of,
Sure.
yeah.
So actually, it's an interesting discussion. It didn't make it into my final draft of the dissertation because I had to not talk about Yavna so much, but it's quite fascinating to see the difference. I think I would say that the Yavna school is situated in an environment where there's a tremendous amount of emphasis on academics. So having been through the yeshiva world schooling system, I can say that there's huge, kavod haTorah, and for people who are scholars of Torah, and there's a lot of emphasis on learning and academic excellence. And I think that perhaps there was like, the boys have their thing that is very involving and engaging, and obviously our girls are going to do something like that. But when you look at the curriculum, it's kind of surprising. And I would say the Bais Yaakov curriculum is also surprising. They teach things that I think, without a doubt, today we would not teach. Not just stories from Greek mythology, but other things that, for sure, in the Yavna curriculum, you would say that's kind of shocking, some of the stories that are in there. at some points I sort of wrestled myself with like, did Rabbi Bloch know that this was in here? Maybe he didn't really know, because I can say that when I was in school, I remember a teacher, showed us a video at some point, and I, in my ninth grade mind, thinking none of the administrators have any idea that this is happening, like, um, but when I started to look at the you can actually look at the transcripts of the students who graduated from there, and it includes his daughters, his nieces. Like, there's no way that he didn't know what was happening. So, what does that mean? I don't have an answer, but I mean, I don't have that answer. I have an answer, perhaps, which is that it's possible that he felt that it's better to boundary these topics within a kosher environment to provide some kind of like feedback forum for them, as opposed to just letting them discover it on their own. Because if they're curious, they're going to go there anyway. And since that is part of their culture, this emphasis on academics, wouldn't it be better if we present it through our lens and help them understand either why this is not for us, or how we can make it, something that allows us to go forward with our own personal growth in Torah. That was my takeaway from it.
And you're saying that Bais Yaakov didn't necessarily have the same emphasis on high
So
academics.
So Bais Yaakov did have high academics, and I think that one of the sources that I read, Rachel Manikin, in a different context, was quoting from this young Lithuanian girl who was essentially saying, these Polish girls are such simpletons, they don't know anything, like, I'm much more sophisticated, which was a kind of a funny thing to read, but also I think probably reflected some of the attitudes of the time, which is definitely that the Lithuanian world looked upon the Hasidic world as, a little bit less intellectual, more emotional, less sophisticated. What I would say is that the Yavna curriculum was, at least there's a lot more information that I found, many, many more lengthy general studies program. They also had a very high Judaic studies program, and everyone came out reading and speaking Hebrew fluently with grammar and everything. One of the famous stories there was one of the graduates, when they moved to the United States, her husband was a Rosh Yeshiva. She went to Columbia University to get a degree in math, and she took an intake exam, and they basically told her, like, you can go into the graduate program because you already know so much math. Now, obviously, she could be an outlier, but it says something about the quality of the program. But leaving aside subjects like math, which are probably more parv, if you look at the actual literature program, it was deeply immersed in the Western canon, in German, readings, which at the time were considered like, the height of sophistication and intellectual stimulation, and they really delved deeply into them. I think one of the things that was interesting to me was kind of going through and thinking about what are the implications of reading something like this. It definitely exposed them to the greats of Western culture in a way that is still puzzling on some level. Like, what were they going to do with that? I'm not sure, honestly. I don't know.
Well, I think like you said, like when you're making a change, you have to think like this is already a huge shift from what was happening before, right? So it's like if girls are learning in a Jewish environment with like religious teachers, like giving them like a Jewish perspective, that's already like a massive like change from what was going on before. And I guess there's a limit to how much you can push it so quickly,
Well, the other thing is that most of their teachers were actually German Jews in Lithuania. In other words, the people who were coming to teach them were often German Jews who had PhDs or other, advanced degrees, who were coming to learn in TELS. And on the side, they did this to earn some money. So you have a really, like a very strong cross-cultural diffusion happening there in the Baltic states.
Wow, interesting. And how would you describe like the differentiation, like hashkafically, between the Hirschian philosophy in his schools and, Yavna or Bais Yaakov?
So I think that this is something that is still hard to tease apart a little bit. Um, and I would say part of what Hirsch was trying to do was to bring German culture, which was so appealing, under the rubric of Torah. And I think in Lithuania, it was more about providing intellectual stimulation and opportunities for Torah growth for girls, but it's still happening within this setting of the yeshiva world. and that strong emphasis on academics is still very much there. I don't. They're not. They're definitely not accepting anything that we would consider to be quote modern Orthodox, or even like Zionism was not something that they were accepting. It was very clearly defined. Like they still are deeply in the yeshiva world. Just because they're learning about something doesn't mean that that's now part of their values, I guess you could say. And in Bais Yaakov, what I would say is actually there's a tension within Bais Yaakov that exists from the very inception, because on the one hand, you have Sara Schenirer, who herself, I think, was conflicted. I would say she was a very holy person, no doubt in my mind, having read about her, and a very righteous person. And at the same time, she was deeply curious, very much looking for not just intellectual stimulation, but meaning and purpose. Like she was if you read about gifted individuals, and they have like they often have these like areas of deep passion, or like yearning for something higher than themselves. She was all of that. And Dr. Deutschlander, who's coming with his dissertation about Goethe and the Old Testament, as he titled it, and he was known as the scholar of Goethe around the world, and he is the one who's putting together the curriculum. And at the same time, they're partners. They're like sort of like the mother and father of Bais Yaakov, and they have fairly different views. I think one of the things that's very interesting to me to think about. Recently, I read Dr. Eli Rubin's book about Hasidus, the rupture of modernity. A very interesting book, and he talks there about how, on some level, everything in the world is Hashem, and he discusses how Spinoza essentially secularized godliness, whereas Hasidus seeks to divinize nature. And I think that in their theoretical framework, those are two vastly different approaches. But when they are actually enacted, sometimes the outcome can look very similar. And I think that's where some,
Wow, so interesting.
back and forth comes. So, you know, that trying to understand, how do I make everything ein od milvado and yet b'chol derechacha de'ehu? Like, how do you find that balance between those? Do they work together? In one, you're basically like obliterating everything and only Hashem exists. And the other, you're saying really everything is stemming part of and only exists because it's part of Hashem. So I think that kind of is, for me, this line between the Hirschian approach and Hasidic approach, which is this interesting question of like, in actuality and practice, they often look similar, but they're different in their sources.
Yeah, yeah. I think something that was so fascinating to me in reading this was about, how Sara Schenirer, she's like comes from a Hasidic family, so she's like really bringing this like Hasidic passion and enthusiasm, and like a lot of like the customs and like the practices they do in Bais Yaakov are very much influenced by like Hasidic culture, right? Like the dancing and the singing and the enthusiasm,
Right.
but then there's also sort of like this like push and pull of like there being this influence of like academics and high intellectual rigor and all of those things. And I think like having that tension of both of those things together was sort of what created this very unique blend in Bais
Yes.
Yaakov, and it was able to attract like such a diverse group of girls in the
Yeah.
school, which I
Right.
think is fascinating.
I think one thing I would say that was different about Bais Yaakov than Chavatzelis, for example, which existed at the same time, is that Chavatzelis prepared students to take the end of gymnasia exam that would allow you to go into college, and Bais Yaakov did not. Bashita, they did not. So in other words, the idea was essentially like, this is the end, or you go to seminary and then you become a teacher, or you go to one of our trade schools. They had many other post high school options, but there wasn't a go on to college option, whereas in Chavatzelit there was. So that's a big difference.
Right. I think I remember you also writing that Chabad in general had much less emphasis on the Judaic studies, and I think from one of the descriptions you recounted there from one of their graduates, or whatever, like it wasn't so successful in really inspiring this like deep loyalty and connection to Yiddishkeit.
Right.
While Bais Yaakov, that really was their entire mission, and I think it was largely successful. Would you say that's true?
Yes. Yes. I think the other thing that's interesting, and there's a quote from Rabbi Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg, who talks about how he, in fairly scathing terms, basically says the people who are trying to like find a way for Germanism and Judaism to walk hand in hand, these are not the future builders of Yiddishkeit. Why? Because the first wind that comes along is going to blow them away, because they're not deeply rooted in their Yiddishkeit. They're trying to accommodate it with whatever they feel is like their quote real life. Like it doesn't have, Yiddishkeit doesn't have to stop you from being successful, from being educated, you could still be, smell good and look nice. And this idea that somehow Yiddishkeit is an impediment obviously doesn't result in long-term adherence. Whereas that's not truly what Rav Hirsch would have said. In fact, he has in many places talks about the people who are so, he talks about, like, for example, the Wissenschaft, which was studying Jewish culture and history, and he talks about how you care so much about what color Rashi's coat was, but you don't care about what Rashi said. Like you're getting into the weeds of, what does it mean to be Jewish and Jewish history and culture and identity, and you're missing out on the Torah part, which is the whole thing. So I think that Chavetzeles also did not have a central figure, and that's part of it. Like Bais Yaakov had a central figure. Sara Schenirer was the central figure. Even though Dr. Deutschlander was there, he was not it for Bais Yaakov. He was part of the support system, and a crucial part. But Chavetzeles didn't have that person who was like, when you think Bais Yaakov, you think Sara Schenirer. There was no, like, when you think Chavetzeles, you think. It was just, It also was led by a group of rabbis. Bais Yaakov was led by a woman. These really have different messaging also. And for girls who are looking for, a model, somebody inspiring to follow, a connection. Obviously, it's a very different relationship if you have a rabbi as your school head, as opposed to a female who you feel connected with, perhaps.
Wow, that's so fascinating. I never have thought about that before. That a huge difference between Bais Yaakov and other schools was the fact that it was headed by a woman.
Yeah.
And the power of having a female leader in that kind of position and that kind of role and mentorship role for the girls is hugely impactful. I guess my next question is, so I know after Sara Schenirir's passing, there was some disagreement about what was her true intention with Bais Yaakov, and how some people felt, in terms of that push and pull of are we going to move more towards the just focusing on Torah and this authentic, passionate connection to Yiddishkeit versus focusing more on the academic, intellectual side of it. There was some debate about what her intention was, and the school ended up moving more towards, I guess you could say, the Haredi sort of tendency based on, who was it who took over?
Orlia.
Yeah.
Orlia. Yeah.
Right.
Because while Sara Schenirer was alive, she and Dr. Deutschlander essentially created a sort of situation of ambiguity. And I think it was deliberate, because they were trying to appeal to a wide audience, some of whom maybe would have been a candidate for Chavetzelet in the sense that they were perhaps coming from more secular families, or families that were not secular necessarily, but felt like it was important that girls go on to college, or that they wanted to be, ready for independence and self-support. We didn't go into one of the kind of strange backgrounds of Bais Yaakov, but shockingly, and when I first read it, I thought this sounds like a made-up story, but it turned out to be tragically very true, that there was a large number of girls who were involved in what they called white slavery at the time, who were basically impoverished to the point where they had to actually sell themselves in order to put food on the table. And this was one of the appeals that they used in their fundraising, but I think it actually was not just cynical and for monetary gain. I think it actually was about how do we prepare girls who maybe don't get married. And I think the fact that Sara Schenirer herself had been divorced and had time where she had to support herself maybe gave her an appreciation for there could be a situation where there's no husband to support you. What are you going to do? And so they made these trade schools and so forth. But I think that the ambiguity in Bais Yaakov was, on some way, it was like a state of constant isometric tension, where they were, on the one hand, reading Iphigenia and Taurus or Nathan the Wise, and on the other hand, really impressing upon girls the importance of having a true and authentic connection with Yiddishkeit, going to dance at the Kever of the Ramah, Rosh Chodesh pilgrimages, having as Naomi Simon calls it, a Hasidic court experience with Sara Schenirer as the Rebbe. It was this very interesting mixture of contradictions all in one. And I think maybe it's actually a reflection of Sara Schenirer herself, in the sense that she loved the theater. She was very curious. She read philosophy. She read books about, women's, quote, emancipation. And I think was sorting herself out even in her late 20s and 30s. After her divorce, I think she was still kind of figuring out, who am I? And I think that this state of ambiguity in Bais Yaakov is a reflection of that, but also on some level deliberate in perhaps saying, like, you can still be a person who loves Torah mitzvos and cares deeply and also enjoy theater. It just should be kosher theater. Like, maybe that was part of what she was trying to provide. However, she and Dr. Deutschlander both passed away within very short time of each other. And essentially, the person who took over, Rabbi Orlean, was a Ger Chassid. He never went to a secular studies program. And he felt like we've gone down this road far enough. We need to pull everyone back from the abyss before we fall into, as he called it, like this mass psychosis of college and secular studies. And that's not the answer to your life and a search for meaning. I think what I would say is, and I don't remember which scholar said this, but in other words, all of the secular learning can provide you with information, but it doesn't provide you with a life's purpose. It's not about who you are. It's a tool to be used. I think that Rabbi Orlean felt like there are other ways to get these tools. Perhaps we don't necessarily need all of we don't need Goethe in our curriculum necessarily. And I think that this sort of unusual amalgam of the Yekish and Hasidic world, which had sort of like, it hadn't quite coalesced. It was sort of like just always coexisting together. It wasn't like it became its own amalgam of a singular thing. It was just this interesting, like, if you think about a cell, it was like lots of organelles floating around inside, all in this one cell, but they hadn't become a single unit, And so I think that what happened is that and I think also we cannot ignore the rise of Hitler and how German Jews were sort of suddenly looking back and saying, like, wait a second, was this whole philosophy that I had about, Germanism and Judaism sort of living side by side, was that just a fantasy? Have I been duped? Maybe I was a fool. And even before the war, some German Jews were starting to say, this was like a fever dream. And that's not really authentic Torah. The second thing that happened is, and I think that I did mention there, is that there was a feeling like you can't have a single stream of something, because what do you mean? Everyone comes from different communities. And this was also partly why at the time the Ger Hasidim, the Belzer Hasidim did not send their daughters, because they felt like we have our own Belzer customs, our own Shita, our own Derech. We want our daughters to reflect their upbringing. We're not interested in having them come back with some kind of like spam culture. I say spam not in the sense of computers, but more like, mushed together. It's not any one thing. Like, it's a little of this and a little of that. That's not a derech, So they felt like every community, and the Gemara talks about every community has their own stream, and you're basically trying to like make one big stream, but in the process you're losing all these nuances of everyone's own customs and cultures. Maybe a little bit the way that people talk today about Ashkenormative, you know what I mean? Like, what about the Persians Jews? What about the Greek Jews? What about the, and so forth? And on all those different customs and things that they do, suddenly it's all now, matzo balls and latkes. And that's not really authentic tradition. I mean, it is someone's authentic tradition. But in this sense, I think that Orlean felt like, A, looking at what's happening in Germany, B, looking around and feeling like, wait a second, we've gone too far with this approach. And I think C, feeling like, let's come back to an authentic Torah perspective, perhaps fearing that, like, we're coming in another way back to kind of circling back to where we were when girls' school started, which is the allures of the secular world. So he did pull things back in many ways. And at the same time, from all the things that I've read, he was a very charismatic and deeply inspiring and devoted person, to the extent that once the ghettos were put in place, girls actually went to learn with him. Like they had gatherings to learn with him because they wanted his inspiration and guidance. And of course, apropos of what we were saying before, it's also a very different school now, because it's led by Rabbi Orlean and not by, Mother Sara, as they kind of talked about her. So it has a very different feeling. And I think that post-war, what happened is that Bais Yaakov went from being more associated with the Hasidic world to becoming much more associated with the yeshivish world. And after the war, also other Hasidic groups opened schools. So you have Bais Ruchel, and you have, the Vizhnitzer schools for girls and so forth, each with their own approach to teaching girls how to handle the whole issue of Torah study for girls, whether they study inside or outside, or they don't, or photocopies, or certainly Gemara is off the table for most of them. But even something like studying Mefarshim or Rashi or Chumash inside, they each of these communities has their own perspective. They don't want to feel like we just lost our girls to, okay, Baruch Hashem, it's not off Yiddishkeit, but like another derech that's not ours.
Okay, I really want to get more into that and like the influences of all of this historical background on the way girls' schools run today. But I don't want to leave out, before we do that, talking about Achas HaTamimim, which you spend a good portion of your dissertation talking about. And this is like a little known and but also very revolutionary movement that was going on in Latvia. Tell us a little bit about the history of Achas HaTamimim, and you focus specifically on a fascinating woman, Adel Radin.
Yeah,
Sorry, what was her?
Dubin.
Dubin, thank you. Adel Dubin. And yeah, I would love for you to tell us a little bit about that history and about her in particular.
So Adel Dubin actually was born Edith Pappenheim, and she's a member of the very large Viennese Pappenheim family. They were actually Hungarian, so Austro-Hungarian, probably infamously known because of the famous Anna O, who was Freud's patient, who was really actually Adel's father's cousin. And her family, Adel's family, was deeply involved with Bais Yaakov and Agudas Yisrael in Vienna. And her family was very, very, very Orthodox. She herself attended the Krakow Bais Yaakov, so she knew Sara Schenirer, and she knew many of the other founding figures of the Bais Yaakov movement because of her time there. She also was friends with Rabbi Heschel's daughter, so the Kapushnitzer Rebbe. The Gerari family is a descendant of theirs. So that was kind of an interesting little crossover, and apparently she actually made the shidduch between Chava Heschel and Zalman Gerari, which was kind of a surprising link to find. But Edith Pappenheim, she actually was. It's unclear to me how her family was connected with the Frierdiker Rebbe, but there is an article in the Heint magazine newspaper about a Farbrengen that he had at their house for the Agudas Yisrael members of Vienna, and he told some interesting stories, essentially stories about secular Jews becoming more connected to Yiddishkeit through Hasidus, which is a sort of interesting subtext of some of those conversations and writings. So essentially in 1935, Rabbi Chayfetz of Latvia wrote a letter to the Frierdiker Rebbe asking if it would be appropriate for Rabbi Dubin's future daughter-in-law to study Hasidus. So this is Edith Pappenheim. When she moved to Riga, she started using her Jewish name Adel, but in Vienna she was known as Edith. And the Frierdiker Rebbe wrote back with a very lengthy, 10-page letter about the place of women in Hasidus and learning Torah, and how historically this was always a value in Hasidic families and Chabad families, that the girls studied Hasidus just like their brothers did. And that he responded with a program for Adel to study, Maimar Kinyan Chaim, which he had delivered a few years earlier in Riga, and also some very interesting directions about how she should study it, that she should study it slowly, she should review it many times, and she should translate it into the language that she thinks in. So she essentially was to read it and write summaries in German. I found that interesting because, in schools today, one of the conversations we have sometimes is it important that a test should be written in Hebrew, or if we want them to learn Yiddish, should we be teaching Yiddish sichos as opposed to Hebrew sichos? And what I took away from this is that the most important thing, aside from the language, which is nice, is that the personal connection. Like, she should rewrite it in her own words so that it means something to her. And I thought that was very thought-provoking. After Adel Dubin had been studying Hasidus for about maybe 8 or 9 months, she was given an assignment, and I wasn't able to find the initial communication about this, but she was charged with translating a letter called A Reply to a Letter from Germany. It seems that a woman who was a professor named Chava Bittner had written to the Frierdiker Rebbe asking, should German Jews study Hasidus? which is fascinating, and it's just kind of interesting how all these things coalesce together. And the Frierdiker Rebbe wrote a reply not only about the question about whether they should learn Hasidus, but also explaining, in a sense, what is Hasidus, what are the most famous founding documents, the Rebbeim, their teachings, what is the, like, if you had to encapsulate what is Hasidus, and basically the encapsulation is that Hashem and the Torah are one, and there's an upper, a high, like a revealed and a hidden level for each of those, and how they all connect. So Adel Dubin was charged with translating this document from the original Hebrew into German, and then the Frierdiker Rebbe asked our Rebbe to take over kind of the project management of this and publish it in a book. And there's a lot of letters from the Rebbe to, from our Rebbe to Rabbi Chodakov, who was the head of the ministry, the Jewish division of the Ministry of Education in Latvia at the time. He was very young, but he was a government minister, and he was asked to participate in this project. So the two of them were the project managers, and Adel Dubin, who at the time was about 20, was translating this work. And I think it's also fascinating to think she's only been studying Hasidus for a few months, not even a year at this point, and she's been given this very momentous task. And in fact, our Rebbe writes in one of the letters about how this is the first document, the first printed matter that's being translated into another language, a Western language. So other than Hebrew or Yiddish, it's being translated into German. And so it's, we have to make sure everything is done at the utmost level of perfection. And if it's a success, then perhaps we can be given permission to publish Hasidus in other languages. So this is also, when you think about it, a pretty shocking all around. It was really surprising. So
what's interesting?
yeah.
I don't know if Dr. Susan Handelman. I interviewed her a while back, but she also was the first person, I think, to translate a mimer into English. Is that true? And she translated Kundras and Yanis Harzach Hasidus, and that was also done by women. So I think that's so interesting that this is like,
I did not know that.
the first piece of Hasidus translated into German was also done by
A
women.
woman.
Yeah.
Yes, very interesting. And the level of detail that was attention to detail. The paper should be a deckled edge. It should be a thick paper. The way the font should be chosen is like a navy. It should be a nice color with an interesting font. So you can actually see a copy in the Aguch library, and it's this like very Art Deco looking font in a navy blue color, which is unusual, and it's kind of in like I would say like a bencher size. It's not a super big, but it's just the level of detail was quite fascinating. And you see in the front translated by, and it says E von Pappenheim, but it doesn't say Fraulein. And apparently that was a conversation like the Rebbe said we should take the word Fraulein off when we publish it. And I'm not sure what the of course was. Like maybe it is because she was already married at that point, or because people won't read Hasidus written by a woman, or they'll say, oh, she's only a girl, what does she know? I wasn't really clear. But it was interesting to see that. And to actually
Interesting.
hold the booklet in my hand was like I don't have like a good reference for it. It was just like a very moving moment for me to be able to hold this little booklet in my hand and think, wow, this is the outcome of this young woman and what she accomplished. And when she ended up moving to Riga after she married Zalman Dubin, she became kind of like a proto-shlucha. I don't think there were any shluchos at that time in the sense that she was essentially traveling across Latvia, speaking about Taras Mishpacha, all at the tender age of 20, 21 years old, writing articles for Heinz about the importance of Jewish women in history and their role that they play. She spoke to youth groups. She spoke to the Banos and Bais Yaakov, which in Latvia was a youth group and a women's group, not a school per se, because they had the Torah V'derech Eretz school. But she just was like really charismatic. She was confident. She quoted Rambam, and she quoted Hume. She was just like just a really interesting, unique person altogether. Yeah. So I think I would say one of the things that was fascinating was to read her letters in Heinz. And in my appendices, I put together all of her articles that she wrote, and I translated them. And I don't think anyone sadly, I don't think anyone really knows about her. They know about her in a very general sense, like, oh, the daughter of so and so who married, Rabbi Dubin's son. She was the one who did this, but nobody really actually went further to see, like, who was she? What was her life like? What did she learn? What did she write? That was very interesting and touching and sad because unfortunately she was killed in the Holocaust, which was I kind of feel like why her story was lost. Like, when you think of Judith Grunbaum, she escaped from Germany and made her way to England. So like we have her story. She was involved with founding Bais Yaakov in England and involved with kinder transport and the rescue. Adel Dubin also was involved with rescue. In fact, Basia Bender, who was part of the Bais Yaakov Yeshiva world, was a friend of hers and contacted her to say, we're trying to help Bais Yaakov girls escape from Poland, from Russia. How can you help? And she actually set up like a financial fund for them and found a place for them to stay. She was very deeply involved with many different things and was a real powerhouse. She and her husband did not have any children, and I sort of wondered if maybe part of her kind of decision to go into talking about Taras Mishpacha was kind of like a attempt maybe to have like a schus to have children. I'm not sure. I don't know, but that was kind of a thought that occurred to me. But she and her husband communicated with the Frierdiker Rebbe. I didn't see letters so much between the Frierdiker Rebbe and her, but I did see one to her father referencing her and talking about her translation. So that was a story that I think still needs to be told in more detail. And I hope to restore her to the history of Jewish women's education, is what I can say about Adel Dubin. And at the same time that she was involved with her translation work and getting married and moving to Riga, there was a group of young girls who were from Chabad families, mostly, and they were the ones who picked up this Megillas Yud Tes Kislev, and essentially they started their own Hasidic study group, getting together to learn Hasidus, and they wrote a letter to the Frierdiker Rebbe about this, and he wrote back to them with tremendous brachos and also appointing 3 rabbis to oversee their program, and then sending very particular details about what they should study and how they should study it, which again kind of echoed the same approach with Adel Dubin, which it wasn't just like, that's great, Hatzlacha, go study Hasidus, but really giving them particulars about what they should study. And that also he gave them the name Achos Tamimim, which before they were just a group of girls. I think they called themselves Nesheu Benos Chabad or something like that, or probably Benos Chabad. And the Frierdiker Rebbe gave them the name Achos Tamimim and explained because the boys' school is Achei Tamimim, so you're Achos Tamimim. Interestingly enough, in America, they were Achos Ha Tamimim. And I don't know if it's because the Ha is for the girls in Riga that they now are like the sisters of that group. Because the Achos Tamimim, even you find them often listed both ways, but in the letters of the Frierdiker Rebbe, it was always Achos Tamimim, no Ha. And it's a small word, but I think the difference is, are they the sisters of the Tamimim who are the boys, or just the way that the Achei Tamimim are the boys' division of Tomchei Tamimim, so Achos Tamimim is the girls' division of Tomchei Tamimim. And I think that's kind of the difference.
Wow, that's fascinating. I always wondered about that. I was like, is that the meaning of Achos Tamimim, that like we're the sisters of the Tamimim? But that's a very interesting nuance.
That's my understanding of
Yeah.
it. Yeah.
Fascinating. Okay, so in the time we have left,
Yeah.
I think I want to get into like some of like the modern sort of implications of all of this.
Yeah.
Like, how do you see all of these, pre-war movements for girls' education? And it's hard for us to really know what would have happened had there not been World War II and all the devastation that created. But then we have sort of the aftermath afterwards. Once Jews moved to America, and Israel, and how do the influences of those schools that existed in pre-war Europe, how do they influence the schools today, and specifically the curriculum? And I know your dissertation was focused more specifically on the relationship with secular studies, and I would love to hear about that too. But also, I'm like really curious about the Jewish studies, like the Torah learning that's done in schools today, and how is the curriculum designed, and how's that influenced by those schools?
It's a fascinating question. So I guess one thing that's interestingly similar between Bais Yaakov and Achos Tamimim is that both of them set up branches in the United States before the Holocaust. So Bais Yaakov in the United States was set up by Vichna Eisen Kaplan, and actually her nephew taught at our school here in Pittsburgh for many years. And it was actually sort of funny to see in the Bais Yaakov curriculum. The Jewish history curriculum was from the Bereshis until current times, and that was exactly the same curriculum he used when he was teaching Jewish history here. I don't know if he just called his aunt and she told him this is what you do, but I thought that was an interesting thing. And before there was a Beis Rivka, Achos Hatamim was founded in the United States already before the war, and they were also given 3 shepherds, the same as the girls in Riga, but they had, it seems like it was a little bit, they didn't have the same, like the Riga branch was given the title Central Branch. It's my understanding from everything that I read that it seemed like the Friedrich Rebbe was going in a direction of like a network of schools, that with the center was going to be in Riga, and there would be branches in all these other cities in Latvia and across the world. There would be branches of Achos Tamimim. And I think that with that understanding of looking at the curriculum that he gave them, 2 things really stand out. One is a very high degree of independence and sort of like charge to be leaders, which is a little bit different than I saw in Bais Yaakov, where there were girls who were trained to be teachers, but they were going out to start a school. But it was still under the aegis and the guidance of the central branch, in the sense that like they really had to like get direction and guidance. And what I saw from the Friedrich Rebbe to the girls of Riga was essentially like, you're empowered to do what you need to spread Hasidus in your area. And you're not just empowered, you're charged to do that. And so the girls write back letters of things like, you know, we started a Farbrengen. They use the word Farbrengen all the time. We had a Farbrengen in Dvinsk, and so many girls came, and here's what we did. And, you know, we said these psukim and these recited these maimarim, and we learned these topics. They immediately jumped right into like what I would call real Hasidus. The same with Adel Dubin, which was, she didn't start with like a let me introduce you to like the basics of Hasidus. What is it about? What are our central tenets? She didn't start with let's start with chapter 1 of Tanya. She was just like, this is a mimer, go learn it. You know, learn it with Rabbi Chaifetz. And I think that the same thing that happens in the United States, the girls are also given what I would call real Hasidus to learn. And the message that I think that comes across is this, what the Rebbe said himself, which is like, you are Hasidim. As opposed to, and Dr. Lowenthal talks a lot about this transformation from the daughters of Hasidim, the sisters or wives of Hasidim, to becoming Hasidim of their own, which I think is unique to Chabad. I don't think there's another group where the women see themselves as a Chassid of that particular Rebbe. They'll say, my husband is, or my father is. And Lubavitch is really unusual in that sense. And I would say that, along with what I saw from the Rebbe, which, you know, the famous Sikha from Parshas Emor about women learning Gemara, and a conversation that he had with the Belzer Rebbe about girls learning, I think that the Rebbe maybe tailored his message to each audience a little bit differently. But the bottom line that comes across is girls should be learning real Torah, and not, you know, not a watered down version. And even something like where our Rebbe says, you know, what girls should be learning, not just the Agadata, but even the Shakla Vitaria. Why? Because people enjoy that, because it's intellectual stimulation that people like. And I think that sometimes that argument is used against women learning, like, oh, you're only doing this because you like intellectual stimulation. Like, that's a bad thing. You know, like, you're only eating this because you have an appetite. Well, what do you mean? Like, Hashem made me with a brain. I have an appetite for intellectual stimulation. What should I fill it with? Should I fill it with Hume? I could. Or Goethe or Shakespeare. Yeah, I could. But also I have not just an intellectual stimulation, but my emotional needs and my ruchnius needs. And I think that what I would say is that kids today are really desperately thirsty for purpose and meaning. And especially, you know, not to get into the whole social media conversation, which is different, but the amount of stimulation that they're under and subjected to all the time, but stimulation that's extremely shallow and doesn't really have anything that is sustaining. It's like living off of potato chips and, root beer. Like, yeah, you could stop being hungry, but it's not nourishing you. And I think what I saw from the Frierdiker Rebbe's letter, for example, to Chaya Sara Michalover, who we didn't go into, but Dr. Lowenthal has an amazing article about it, and she essentially writes to him to say, okay, I'm committed to Torah and mitzvos, but I'm doing them, but what can I do to fill the emptiness of action? I don't feel inspired. And she gets this lengthy letter in response about how she can meditate in a way that what she has, moach shalit al halev, how to make the intellectual information actually trickle down into her emotions in a way that it becomes part of her, and not just like, they talk in Chassidus about how the neck is supposed to connect the head and the heart, but sometimes it literally just separates them. And there's the head floating over here, and then there's the heart, which has its own agenda, and they're not connected. So I think that the authenticity and the real personal connection is something that the Frierdiker Rebbe was very tuned into. That our girls, that all girls, women, just like everyone else, needs to feel personally invested and connected to. And I think even the way that the Rebbe wrote about how, like, I look upon you as my daughters and I want to hear everything about you, I think just that feeling of unconditional acceptance is very important for kids today. And without that, you can't even get to the next step, which is the chassidus and the learning, which they want and need, but don't always know that they want and need. And I think that along those lines, when you look at the different publications that the Achos Tamimim put out, which we didn't even talk about, but they published a number of works. One was their own translation of the reply to a letter from Germany, which they translated from Hebrew into Yiddish. But they also they asked the Rebbe to give them write a piece of Chassidus for us. And the Rebbe wrote a letter called Igeras Kiyum Nefesh Misrael about the preciousness of every single Jewish soul. And what does it mean to look upon all the Jews around you and understanding every single one is a piece of Hashem, and how to relate to them. And they published this and reprinted it a number of times. So clearly it was a very important document to them and had great value, not just because the Rebbe gave it to them, but also the content itself. So I think understanding that within Lubavitch, a woman's connection with Yiddishkeit, with Torah, with learning, is maybe perhaps way back when it started out as a b'diavad, but it's not anymore a b'diavad. It's now like, this is how we actually run our community and how we approach girls learning. It's not just like something, oh, you just want to be a boy, or you're only doing that because it actually is, from what I saw from the Rebbeim, very clearly in black and white, not my own interpretation, a message that, yes, this is a necessary thing we must do.
So just to clarify, so the Achos Tamimim, it was started in Riga, and I guess maybe also in America. Was that like an after-school program, or was it an actual school? And I'm assuming there was no secular studies involved. This is just Chassidus. Is that true?
Yeah, so the Achos Tamimim group in Riga and in the United States were after-school programs. The girls in Riga were attending the Torah V'derech Eretz school, which was started by Rabbi Tzviel Baranchik, but it was run by Rabbi Chadakov, the same Rabbi Chadakov who later was the Rebbe's secretary. He was the minister of education for the Jewish schools, as I mentioned, and he was the principal for the school. And he worked very hard to remove what we might call secularist influences within the school system and make it more wholesome and reflective of Torah values. So the girls attended that school, which was still a very Hirschian approach. And then after school, they went to this after school program, which was their own choosing to belong to, not the school that they attended. But that also explains why you would have the famous picture of these girls with with Rebbetzin Shana Sarah, and they're all wearing, uniforms with ties and pins, and it looks very official. The other picture looks more like maybe Malav Malka, perhaps. I'm wondering if it maybe was the time that they asked the Frierdiker Rebbe for Yechidus, and maybe that's when that photo was taken. I don't know if we can ever find out. Maybe, somewhere in Latvia, it could be that the photos are in a folder somewhere.
Wow, interesting. Yeah, so maybe like my take on all of this is, I think, there's this sense I think you can even see in the schools, and like as you were describing in your dissertation, like the curriculum and like the sense you get from looking at the way these schools were run is that it's a negotiation with modern culture, right? So there's this modern, there's an enlightenment there's all this, academia that's out there, and our girls are very much immersed in that world, and we're sort of like trying to negotiate that and sort of recreate a school. And I remember actually in one letter that you put in there from the Friedrich Club, the Friedrich Club even says that, like, you're not creating a yeshiva. You're creating a school, but it's a Jewish school, right? So like we're sort of trying to imitate what the German schools, or the not the Polish schools, whatever they were, and we're sort of, with the same sort of standards and structure and all of that, but just like with the Jewish flavor, with the Jewish environment, with the Jewish, values and all of that. And in some sense, we're sort of trying to meet the modern culture where it's at, but also, sort of still maintain that those Jewish values. And I think what was sort of different about Al Amendment was that it wasn't really a negotiation with modern culture at all, right? It's really just we're not even this is not trying to like fight some sort of other secular movement that's going on. We're just trying to bring like authentic chassidus to women.
Right.
Do you think that's accurate? And like,
So I think yes and no. I mean, one of the when the young women of Achos Tamim asked the Frierdiker Rebbe for Yechidus, and it's a very fascinating story. How two of the girls got up and recited Maimarim for the Rebbe, like sort of summarized Maimarim for him, but also the Rebbe addressed them and gave them essentially like a lecture, a sikha, I guess you could call it, and it was about Eishes Chayil. And first of all, he translates the word Eishes Chayil as a woman of power, which I was really taken aback by. I don't think I'd ever seen that anywhere. Usually we say a woman of valor. What does valor mean? I don't know, but a woman of power, like the power, strength to do something, and how every woman has the power to influence her environment, which I think is part of the story of confronting modernity. And later on, it talks about how Isha Yiras Hashem, he tis halal. And he takes the word tis halal and he says, it also could be understood as she is mocked. That in today's day and age, a woman with Yiras Shamayim is mocked. And that's the time you live in. And he tells them straight out, you live in very dark times where the world is giving you messages that are completely opposite from what Torah is telling you. And he's upfront about it. It doesn't, not like, not minimizing the challenge that they're facing and the difficulty of the times that they're in. And I think that was very refreshing for me to see, like, yes, it is difficult. We want our girls, we want all of our kids to feel like Yiddishkeit is wonderful and it's beautiful and we love it, but not pretending that like the world around us is giving us such different messages, and it's hard to resist those sometimes. And I think one of the things that was also striking to me in the deep dive that I did into the girls of Achos Tamimim and finding photographs of them and their mothers and their parents was how non-conformative many of them were. Like you have in your mind, what does the Lubavitcher Chassid look like in the year 1930 in Eastern Europe or the Baltics? It's not necessarily a man who has slicked back hair and somewhat of a trimmed beard, but he, these were, the Hasidim then were confronting many of the same challenges we have today, where the number of women who were mothers of the Achos Tamimim who did not cover their hair, not with a tichel, certainly nothing, the times that they were living in, we sort of like have a lot of sentimentality and nostalgia for the olden days, but these were not the olden days. They were actually very much the modern days. And the challenges that they faced, and the young girls with V-neck shirts, so we I think when we sanitize the past, not to say that we need to highlight their deficiencies. I'm not coming to say that at all, and I'm not coming to say like, yeah, it's okay if you do it too. But the point is, the struggles you have are not new struggles. It's a built-in struggle that's part of it. But there are tools we can give you to help with your struggle, and also. Just because this young woman struggled and had a V-neck, it didn't mean that she couldn't get a letter from the Rebbe to her about her struggles. Like that kind of love, which is, I think, what kids today need, which is, we love you, we accept you, you're struggling. We're not judging you for struggling. We're here to help you. If you want to be helped, we can help you. Obviously, you can't force people to do that. But I think that was something that was very striking for me. So I think that the modernity, especially in the Baltics, was all around them. I mean, in one of the letters, the Frierdiker Rebbe talks about the school uniforms that all the kids wear and his distaste for it, because it's basically like they want to feel they're just like every other Latvian kid. The kid in the Catholic school has his uniform and I have my uniform. And that idea of feeling of like, I want to blend in. But the blending in, we don't, you know, Hein Amaluvadad Yishkon, we don't blend in. That's just not part of our national story. We don't blend in. And the seeking to blend in or wanting to feel, you know, I'm saying all of this in English. That's my native language. I think in English. I dream in English. I don't have another language that's my native language. Yes, I have Hebrew. I have a little Yiddish, very small. But we're all very acculturated in different ways, and it's a constant negotiation of what do I accept. You know, like if it's about chuk asagayim and you can't wear long skirts because that's too trendy. You know, what if you don't know what's trendy? I don't know, but the idea of like trying to maintain our distinct identity in addition to our attachment, which needs to be authentic and true, I think it's a struggle that's been going on at this point for generations, and it's part of living in an open society that is very relevant, whether it's the Baltics or it's the United States today.
Yeah, I certainly was very taken by that as well. The fact that, we romanticize the past a lot. There certainly were elements of, Jewish culture in a previous life that's been lost and that was very treasured and valuable that we should really look back on. But in a lot of ways, like, Judaism is thriving so much more now than it was then. And like when you look then, it was like the rate of assimilation was astonishing. And I think when people sort of bemoan the situation of Jewish life today, it's like we're thriving. Like the amount of it's incredible what's going on now in terms of Jewish life. And yeah, I think that's something that's really valuable to reflect on and think about. And also I just want to like just highlight again what you said earlier about this notion of like when we give girls access to Torah learning on a high level, that's what that changes their sense of identity. Like that sense of like these women feeling like we're Hasidim. We're not daughters of Hasidim. We're not wives of Hasidim. We are Hasidim. I think that's so valuable and transformative. And that happens through like having direct access to the Hasidus
For sure.
of the Rebbe. Yeah.
The fact that the girls felt the courage, if you could say, to write to the Rebbe and say, we want to have an audience.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
And that was then kind of perhaps was like the model, because later on the Rebbe would often speak to women in the downstairs 770 and the men would be upstairs in the women's section, which is kind of unthinkable in other, not just kind of, fairly unthinkable in other communities, that they get to hear from the Rebbe to them as women, which is really something striking. And I think it's not about feminism as a thing. It's really just more about like me as a person of value and worth, and feeling like, yes, the Rebbe cares about me as a person and wants to have a connection with me. And I think that's one of the things that's so striking about this.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. I have a couple more questions. How much time do you have?
Sure.
Okay.
2 more minutes. Yeah.
Okay. So one thing I just wanted to ask you about is, you talk there about the Friedrich Rebbe's memoirs, where he describes some really incredible stories about women of the past before all of these schools started, right? This is like long before any of this revolution in girls, Jewish education began. You have these like individual women who are extremely learned and were passing this like secret tradition on to their daughters about how learned they were. And we even had this like account of like Pearl, the Maharal's wife, also being extremely learned and learning together with her husband. But this is like, we don't have any other historical record of these stories. And which is why like some of these academics are sort of like questioning like what's the authenticity of this. And I'm curious if you can like talk about that a little bit. Like clearly, this was something that wasn't common and was sort of kind of kept secret for a while, which is why we don't really have so many other records of it. Can you talk about that a little bit?
So I don't know that I know enough about it to really give a definitive answer, but my understanding is sort of a few things. One is that the Friedrich Rebbe had a very close relationship with his grandmother, Rebbetzin Rivka. And she is a person who deserves her own book and podcast and an in-depth study. She was orphaned at a very young age, but before she was orphaned, she received a lot of oral traditions from her mother, from her grandmother, from a book that her father had written, stories of the Baal Shem Tov, and then she also later received a lot of stories from her father-in-law. So she became kind of like the wise woman of Lubavitch, the oral repository. She was known as a Baal Shmua. She basically was like the historian. She was the keeper of the oral tradition of Lubavitch. And my understanding is that a lot of the stories in the memoirs are from her, because the Friedrich Rebbe used to spend a lot of time in her house. He sort of like had to earn the, I guess, ability to have private time with her, but he spent many hours with her and I think felt very connected, like kind of a second mother, perhaps. Very deep connection there. And actually, she passed away in Yud Shvat before the Friedrich Rebbe did, but on the anniversary of her passing, he spoke about her with deep affection. And I think she's really a pivotal person in his life. The second thing, and I'll quote Eli Rubin, who I mentioned before. He kind of compares the Friedrich Rebbe's memoirs to Agnon, and I don't know how many listeners are familiar with Agnon, but he wrote a whole story cycle about the town he came from, Buchach, and sometimes you read it and you're thinking like it sounds like it's from a medrash or maybe it's a traditional story. In the case of Agnon, he really actually kind of made most of these stories, authored them himself. They're not actually like things he received. I think in the situation of the Friedrich Rebbe, I think he's looking at the memoirs as a vehicle along the lines of the Megillah of Yotes Kislev. Essentially, he starts to write them after his grandmother passed away, and he wanted to find a way to carry Lubavitch on into the future. And how do you do that if you don't have a town to go back to? The town has been destroyed. The people have been dispersed. There's no more center. And so in the same way that the Megillah of Yotes Kislev that the Friedrich Rebbe wrote came along with guidelines. It wasn't just a letter. It was like, this was 1936. Here's what you should do. How to read this, when to read it, and what to do afterwards, and to give a pan afterwards about how you observe the Yotes Kislev. And this was part of the structure. I think that the Friedrich Rebbe was looking to use story as a way to create a virtual town of Lubavitch that you can all go back to. And I think in there, and I can only wonder. I don't have any answers, I've never seen this, but perhaps as a Rebbe with 3 daughters, he looks at the story of girls' education in a slightly different light. And, we have many letters that the Friedrich Rebbe wrote for his daughters, and clearly, from the fact that at one point he gave power of attorney over to Rebbetzin Chaim Mushka when she was still a young unmarried woman, I think looked upon them as, his future. In the same, there was not going to be a male offspring from him, but there was going to be Lubavitcher offspring, and there was going to be the heir was going to be a female on some level, and perhaps this was part of his kind of putting all these pieces together, and maybe also I kind of think about how like World War I and World War II were such ruptures in the world's existence that things that were set in motion were abruptly stopped by the wars and then restarted generations later. So when you think about like feminism, you think about like free love and getting rid of like capitalism and the evils of superficial Gashmias lifestyle, all those things started. Then there was wars. Then later on in the 60s, people were like, wait a second, we were going to build a utopia, what happened? And I think that the time that the Friedrich Rebbe was living in, he saw the devastation of Jewish life in Russia, and he already knew what had happened from his own family with Chaya Kluger. He knew what had happened in situations where girls were not empowered and brought in to the story of Yiddishkeit, and I think he wanted to make sure that there was continuity, that the Achos Tamimim groups existed, that there would be a future for Lubavitcher girls. And even though Bais Rivka was founded a little bit later, and Achos Tamimim basically was folded into that. Once it got off the ground, it was a grade school, and then eventually it was a high school. But there was definitely a period of time in the United States when girls were attending Bais Yaakov and also, part of Lubavitcher families. And I think that the written record that the Friedrich Rebbe was putting together, why was it so important upon coming to America that he finished the memoirs? He felt it was important. Why? I don't know, but my guess is that it's part of this transmission process, the transition from the old world to the new world. We're trying to bring the old world into the new world in a way that anyone can go back there at any time. So when you read the Zichronos, you're transported back in time to various different places and moments. And I think that one of the things, the messages, and here I'll credit my daughter Masha for this beautiful phrase, but she was saying that the Friedrich Rebbe and his recreation of the once and future shtetl of Lubavitch wanted a community where women would be smart and learned And their husbands would be delighted if they read their manuscripts and found little, mistakes to fix. In his mind, this was the ideal. That's what he was preparing for us. Like, what does the ideal Lubavitcher society? What does Lubavitch in 2025 look like? It looks like this.
Yeah, and I think it's remarkable to see like how much time in the memoirs is dedicated to describing these learned women. I mean, there's quite a few examples, like Devorah from Vitebsk and the story of Rachel and Devorah Leah and the Maharal's wife. Like, there's not just one. He seems to be emphasizing this theme numerous times. So clearly, it was of great importance to transmit to the next generation. Okay, so a couple like final questions
Sure.
to end off with. So one is, can you share like one idea? Obviously, I'm sure there's many. One either like Torah idea or something that you like uncovered in your research that like really changed things for you, like the way you see the world, the way you see yourself, something that you can't unlearn.
Okay. Actually, this was one that was shocking to me and really put in perspective some of the things that I see and wonder about. So in that famous Yechidus that the Rebbe had with the Achos Tamimim, he talked about how every single kind of study has a mile and a chesaron, like a strength and a negative aspect to it. And that he said studying Chassidus imbues a person with a certain amount of tokef, which I would say is toughness, like a certain kind of like brazen energy. And nothing stands in my way, and I'm not afraid of anything. And what it opened to my eyes to was how we have graduates from schools who can go off to Timbuktu or Hong Kong or whatever, far-flung places, and at the age of 20, 21, open Chabad houses, lead Torah classes. Like, how do they have that, audacity in a sense to do that? And that was sort of realization number one. Realization number two was the Rebbe talks about how if you chas v'shalom use this tokef on your parents or teachers, it's terrible. And I always was just baffled by how is it that kids could be so disrespectful sometimes. And in the Bais Yaakov world, it's less common. Like, there's a tremendous amount of like Kabbalah Sol and Yerush Shemayim that's drilled into students. Not to say you don't get misbehaviors, but they're just like very, behalten. And in Lubavitch, you get these like sometimes really sassy kids, and you're just like, what is going on here? And I thought, okay, now I understand the tokef. It gave me an appreciation and understanding of this is a built-in feature. So we're not going to drill that out of people. We have to like channel it. When you have that tokef, helping the kids understand like you have a tremendous amount of power. Where are you going to direct your fire hose? That's kind of was a very important realization. And I think in general, just the main takeaway, that was I would say the Torah learning piece. For me, the main takeaway was just a tremendous amount of appreciation for, and actually I would say love for the Frierdiker Rebbe that I didn't have before. Did not really, as I mentioned in our earlier conversation, the photograph that's shared of the Frierdiker Rebbe from his later years when the ravages of MS, and he's not able to make so many facial movements. And I think it does him a disservice. He looks very, very stark. Whereas if you look at some photos from just a few years earlier, you see the Rebbe laughing, and you get a feeling for the warmth. And having spent at this point a few years like reading through many of the Frierdiker Rebbe's letters and his sichos and then Likutei Diburim, just suddenly a feeling of like this tremendously warm and affectionate and loving person who's just like overflowing with effusiveness for people and care and I think at the same time high demands. Like in one of the letters, it starts off with to so and so Isha Elokim Yirei Hashem Chassid. He goes on, lines of accolades, and then basically says like, I know you don't want to do this thing, but you're going to have to do it anyway. Tough. Like that was sort of the follow up, which is, I love you, you're wonderful, and also I have expectations of you. And I think that's the message that we all need at many different points in our lives.
Wow, that's beautiful. Okay, last question, and I feel like you've already mentioned many of these, but maybe give us one or two underrated learning or reading suggestions, something that one might not know about, but you think they might really love.
Okay. So I would start with the Zechronis. If you haven't read them since you were 12, read them again. They're really very inspiring. And I think when you read them as a kid, you miss a lot. As an adult, you'll see all kinds of interesting things, and that's really worthwhile. I would also say if you want to learn more about Bais Yaakov, Naomi Seidman's book is fabulous. She also translated large sections of Sara Scheniner's diary. One upcoming, but I've not yet been able to find it, is someone has translated the Polish portions of Sara Scheniner's diary, which will, I think, be eye-opening to find out who was she before Bais Yaakov, and also things, not to sound like nosy, but there are things that were taken out of the later diaries because I think people felt they would be, quote, confusing. So I'm curious to sort of restore her to her full complexity. I think complex people are more interesting and also more inspiring, I'd like to find out about that. I would also say The Runaway Girls of Galicia by Rachel Manikin is also a very interesting book. So those are the ones I would mention. And also there is not currently a published version of Kuntrus Rabbanis Devar Leah, but if you ask Kahas, they might be able to give you one, and it's worthwhile reading that as well. So
What's that about? Or what does that include?
we didn't really talk about Devar Leah, but the mother of the Tzemach Tzedek, and that's worthwhile reading. Along with, there are 2 biographies about Rebbetzin Rivka, and I know there's 2 articles on Chabad.org that are really worth reading as well. I hope somebody publishes a full and detailed biography of her. I think she's a very inspirational person altogether.
Awesome. Wow. Thank you so much. This was so informative and fascinating, and there's so much more I know that you could share, but hopefully it gave us a little bit of a glimpse into this fascinating story of the development of girls' education. So thank you so much for making the time.
It's been an honor.
Okay.
Take care.